Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, but he's not in the studio. He's up in Virginia solving the problems of the world, giving very, very significant speeches. So he is with us by Skype. Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Wish I were with you in Texas.
Well, good. Daniel, you wrote an article recently for the webpage, the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which caught the attention of a lot of people. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And this comes from a recent interview, actually, on CNN, on Samantha Power, who's our ambassador to the United Nations. And she's our spokesman, for the world audience. But the headline is something else, and this must have been a part of what caught your attention. It says, she's speaking, U.S. to Russia, backing Assad, quote, is not a winning strategy. Well, she's warning them, of course, and my immediate reaction was that, doesn't she know that the policy that the United States has been following since 2011, Assad must go, is not a winning strategy? So I think she has stretched this a little bit. And of course, your concern has been something that we're concerned about all the time is, are we getting the straight scoop? And there is a lot of misinformation and repetition of outright lying that we heard from her. So why don't you fill us in a little bit about what was she trying to portray there, and do you think she achieved what she was trying to do?
Yeah, I think it is almost comical when she says it's not a winning strategy, as if she's ever created a winning strategy. Remember, she was one of the big voices in favor of bringing democracy to Libya, and that has not worked out very well either. And their strategy in Syria has not worked well. We saw a report back in July from the U.S. intelligence community saying that the U.S. attacks against ISIS have had very, very little effect on the organization. But as you mentioned, she brings up a lot of the things that have been discredited. She once again brings up the issue that Assad gassed his own people. And if you remember, that was back in 2013 when the U.S. almost started attacking directly Assad for this. And it turns out that it simply wasn't true, but she repeats it as if it was true. She goes out through the interview doing this several different times. So it's clearly an exercise in propaganda.
And of course, the theme behind this was to blame Russia and, of course, build up the animosity between the United States and NATO and Russia to further aggravate the situation in the other parts of Europe as well, like in Ukraine and Latvia, where we're putting cruise missiles and drones. So this is part of all that scheme. But if you look at just the outright evidence, yes, I imagine Russia has sent some ships in there. They have a port there, and exactly what they sent in, I personally don't know. But we do know that there is an intent on their part to help send in goods that just help people survive under these conditions, because they have been an ally of Syria all along. So this is one thing, but what is it? How many bombs have we used from drones in the last year? Thousands.
I think there have been at least 2,500 airstrikes on Syria alone. And of course, a lot of those have destroyed the infrastructure and factories and places of business. And that's one of the reasons people are fleeing, and they're in absolute economic despair, as well as their concerns about the war. But if you look at Power's interview, she talks about the 12 million that have left Syria, and as you point out, it's almost half the population that have been displaced in this war. She points it out as if it's the fault of the U.S. not doing enough, rather than the U.S. backing this regime change that has turned the country into total chaos.
Before we go into a little bit more about the strategy and the problems that we have there, I want to get the map put up of the region, because in spite of the fact that I think I could mark the states and draw rough outlines, it's necessary for me to go and look at a map. Now here's a map that tells us about the significance of Syria. See, you see two lines coming up. One comes from Saudi Arabia up, and another one but everything comes to Syria, and one comes through Iraq. Of course, we've made Iraq a worthy ally of Iran, so they're interested in that. And Syria is in a key spot there. Both pipelines are coming up in that direction, and they have to go through Syria. So those who chanted early on, back in when the Iraq War, it's all about oil, it's all about oil. It is still a lot about oil, not only drilling oil, but it's a lot about pipelines too, because you know Afghanistan is involved with potential pipelines, and they've been arguing over for 30 years about where the pipelines are going to go. So I just wanted to review that with everybody, and Ned, I didn't know whether you had a comment about this map or not.
Well, it certainly is about oil, but both from an economic perspective and a geopolitical perspective, you know, it has become the U.S. strategy to try to reduce Russia's geopolitical influence, and one way of doing that is to decrease the importance of Russian oil pipelines to Western Europe. And Syria, as the map points out and you point out, Syria is a key center in these pipelines. So it's also about isolating Russia and Iran to a degree.
Yeah, and you know, we're over there. Theoretically, our great enemy is ISIS, and yet she even downplayed this. Powers downplayed this. Oh no, ISIS is not nearly as bad, and it looks like our policies in many ways follow that, because ISIS ends up with our weapons. I think their real goal is geopolitical and pipelines and getting rid of Assad, and if you look at the whole regions, you know, our policies just don't work, and we have talked so much about the refugee problem as a consequence of our problems, and unfortunately nothing seems to improve. But Russia is probably a legitimate opponent of ISIS, as is Iran. So if things were more normal, where we were less involved in entangling alliances and staying out of the affairs of Europe and the Middle East, we would probably see some regional activity that would have prevented from ISIS from ever even have been established.
Well, you know, Russia has long dealt with problems of radicalized Muslims in its southern flank, and you know, the problem, I'm sure the idea of some of these fighters that have been radicalized and trained, and they're even now fighting with American weapons, I think the idea of some of these guys moving up into Chechnya or somewhere else and starting problems in Russia when they're done in Syria probably rightly terrifies them. So they certainly do have more of an interest. They're much more in the neighborhood than we are, let's put it that way.
Well, and you can see why behind the scenes our government may well be sort of friendly with ISIS, because ISIS, in theory at least, is to get rid of Assad. So there are fighters in some ways, because when we send some weapons over there, one group ends up enhancing ISIS, because ISIS would like to get rid of Assad, and that's been our goal. And the stupidity of the whole thing, it's so costly to us financially, it's costly to us as strategically, and yet they never stop. They just come back and they say more, 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 and here Powers is practically, did you sense that it was almost like a threat to Russia? You know, just don't do this. You're getting awfully close to causing a serious problem for yourself.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a threat, and she's portraying Russia and Iran's interests as somehow fueling terrorism, but in reality, it's been the U.S. support of those who want to overthrow. And she makes this great claim. You pointed it out earlier. It's really shocking. She accuses those that are only care about ISIS of being Machiavellian, you know. And but the other thing that is interesting, Dr. Paul, is that we talk about ISIS, and you know, it's the big threat out there, but what we forget is not very long ago, ISIS began as an organization called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was his older name before it called itself ISIS. So that Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged after the U.S. attack on Iraq. It wasn't there, as you know, beforehand. So it's important to look at this. There was a breakaway group of more radical Al-Qaeda that became ISIS. So it all stems back from the U.S. intervention in the first place.
You know, the whole issue is they distort the idea that Russia is allied with Syria. I don't think we can deny that. They are. They have been friends, and they have dealt with each other, and they have a contract, a treaty with them to have a port, probably at least as legitimate, or maybe more legitimate than us in Guantanamo. And so they're their neighbors, and it's very important to them. So we have the Russians allied with Syria. and that's realistic. And legitimately, I believe there's a pretty strong argument that they have, at least a right to do this, and we have an obligation, of course, to stay out. But whom are we allied with? We're allied with Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Saudis are involved in this too. And what kind of reputation do they have? We complain about ISIS being violent. But what about the Sharia mentality in Saudi Arabia? That's still a problem that we just wholeheartedly endorse, never say a word. We talk about, human rights in China and every place else, but we never talk about it in the Saudi. Not that I think we should be talking about it, but we should put things in proper perspective. But here, we're allies with them, and where are they going right now? They're involved in a border dispute, a violent border dispute, and we are openly supporting Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia couldn't fight that war without us, and I'm sure strategically we're giving them a lot of information. So I think the American people ought to question this and realize this, and ask all the presidential candidates some question about this. So and also how does it help us, and where's the advantage? I see none, and that is the reason, of course, we try to bring this subject up quite frequently.
Yeah, well, Samantha Power really is the epitome of hypocrisy in many ways, because she prides herself on this as a great human rights activist, but she's really responsible for what we call the weaponization of human rights. As you point out, our great ally Saudi Arabia has absolutely decimated Yemen, killing thousands of innocent civilians. She's not said a word about their human rights. Within Saudi Arabia, as you point out, though it's none of our business, they've got about the worst human rights record on earth. The great humanitarian Samantha Power had said nothing about it. So it really is turning the concept of human rights into a weapon at the hands of U.S. foreign policy.
On Samantha Powers, diplomatically, what do you think she was trying to achieve, other than the fact just to stir up more anti-Russian sentiment? Was that the whole goal, or was there something that she was pretending that she was trying to promote?
Well, I think, we saw last week some reports and they all emerged from a poorly sourced article in an Israeli newspaper, that Russia was about to invade Syria with several thousand troops. And every article proceeded from that article. And I think, we can get conspiratorial, but I think it really served an important U.S. foreign policy goal to have everyone start thinking about a Russian invasion of Syria, which we would obviously notice if it took place, and it obviously has not taken place. But I think it allows Washington to change the subject when things are going very badly in Syria for the U.S. It really is Assad or ISIS, and the U.S. at least claims it doesn't want either, but there is no alternative anymore. Right. So I think it's a classic example of them trying to change the topic and get people to focus on something else, in this case, the big bad Russian bear.
And unfortunately, the propagandists are winning this in spite of the exposure of the lies to get us in these other wars. I think they more or less have had a propaganda victory over Ukraine. Nobody really talks about NATO and the United States, orchestrating the coup. So this is the same way in Syria. They perpetuate these lies, and they seem to win these battles because they have control of so much of the media perpetrating these stories about how vicious they are. But Russians are probably not angels. But I'll tell you what, they have a lot more legitimacy in this, and we have so much less legitimacy. But people don't think that way. And right now, it looks like the authoritarian approach, unless people's attitude change. Just remember, 2 years ago, the Russians, I think, actually served a purpose when they exposed the lie about the gassing, and they interceded and acted as diplomats. And the British had a vote, and they voted it down to start bombing Syria. And Obama knew he couldn't win it, so he didn't bring about the vote, and they backed off. And that was a result of Russia. So if anybody cares about peace and they care about the truth was that. But what's the result been? Just last week, we talked about the British starting to use drone missiles and participating in the bombing. And you just stated in the last year, we did 2,500 bombing missions, and yet the people have spoken, and their message has been lost. So we're in such a mess, because if we do get a half-hearted vote, it votes against the war, and then they change the propaganda, and then they ignore the vote. So we really have a job cut out for ourselves. So I hope someday that we can get more support for our position.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Liberty Report today, because we have and will continue to emphasize the crisis in the Middle East and in the various spots. But when we tell outright lies, and our officials do that, and they lie us into war, the people deserve to know the truth. And I know it's hard for people to be self-critical and say, you know, and I was on the receiving end of this, no matter how accurate the information was, if it sounded like you were critical of your own government, that was wrong. But I work from the point of view that to be patriotic and care about one's country, you challenge your government. You challenge the government when they're wrong. In this day and age, obedience to the government, and that is the reason that we end up with Ed Snowden be calling, you know, a terrorist and a criminal and committing treason because he's telling the truth, because he's challenging the government. And that's what this is all about, is are we able to sort it out and find out what the government should be doing and what they're actually doing, and are they doing what they say? And that is indeed a big problem, but sound, simple, clear fundamentals could help us get out of this. We should mind our own business, be non-interventionist, be willing to be friends with country, talk to people who supposedly are our enemies, and even in the worst part of the Cold War, we talked to the Soviets and to the Chinese, and the world didn't end. Actually, things improved. But why are we obsessed with the people, the likes of Samantha Powers, with trying to aggravate this situation and precipitate another major crisis, which is absolutely unnecessary? The cause of peace can be found in this world today if we just use a little bit more common sense. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.